They came at dawn when the mist was still hugging the valley, and the birds had not yet learned to fear, and they came with the promise that they would only take a few, and they lied because they always lied, and the old ones in the valley who had seen the world before, the peace smelled the smoke before they saw the riders, and they knew that the earth was about to remember the taste of blood. The riders came from the hills, where the stone teeth of the mountains bit the sky, and their horses were quiet as they moved through the wet grass, and their faces were covered with cloth that smelled of iron and salt, and the leader of the riders looked down at the valley as if it was already his, as if the people in their homes were just dust, waiting for the wind to carry them away, and in the village the children were still asleep in their beds, dreaming of rivers and apples, and the sky that turned pink when the dawn kissed. The mountains and the mothers were waking, lighting small fires to warm water and bread, and the men were checking the fields and the fences, thinking of nothing but the day ahead, and the riders kept coming down the slope like a shadow rolling over the green, and the mist parted as they passed like it was afraid to touch them. The first to see them was an old woman with white hair who was carrying water from the well, and she stopped and looked at them, and she remembered the stories that her grandmother had told her, stories of a world where the earth shook under the feet of men who wanted nothing but fire, and she dropped the bucket and the water spilled into the dirt, and the riders kept coming, and she turned and started to run, and the sound of her feet in the mud was louder than the breath in her chest, and she called out, and her voice was sharp in the morning air, waking birds and dogs and children and men and women, and the riders did not hurry, they did not rush, they moved like they had all the time in the world, because in their hearts they believed they were the hand of something bigger than fear, and they reached the edge of the village. When the first child came out, rubbing sleep from her eyes, holding a wooden doll her mother had carved for her, and the girl looked at the riders, and she saw nothing but dark eyes above cloth and iron, and she did not understand, and the leader of the riders lifted a hand, and the line of horses stopped, and the village held its breath, and for a moment the world was silent, as if even the wind wanted to hear what would happen next, and the leader looked at the child with the doll, and he tilted his head, as if he was curious, as if he wanted to remember her face, and he reached down and picked a flower from the ground, and he held it up to the child, and the child reached out and took the flower, and for a moment she smiled, and then the leader turned to the riders, and he dropped the flower to the mud, and he lowered his hand, and the riders moved forward, and the thunder of hooves drowned the screams, and the old woman who had first seen them fell to her knees as the riders swept past her, and the children ran from their homes, and the mothers screamed, and the men tried to grab axes and pitchforks, but the riders were already there, splitting the air with steel and smoke, and in the middle of it the leader watched with eyes like cold rivers, as if he was not there at all, as if he was somewhere far away, remembering the peace that was dying under his hand. They took the women first, because the women were the river of the village, the women who sang while planting the fields, and who washed the wounds of the sick, and who held the stories of the elders in their soft voices, and the riders knew that if they took the women they would take the spirit of the valley, so they moved through the smoke and the fear, pulling the women from their homes, pulling them from the arms of children who clung to them, screaming and crying as the riders dragged the women to the center of the village, and the leader of the riders watched with eyes that did not blink as his men tied the women with ropes made of horsehair, and the children reached for their mothers, and the riders pushed them back with iron and boots, and the old men shouted and tried to fight with shaking hands, and the riders struck them down, and the ground turned dark where they fell, and the sun climbed higher in the sky, as if it refused to look down, as if it could not bear to see what was happening below, and the women were lined up in rows near the river, their faces marked with tears and dust, and the children watched from the shadows of broken homes, clutching each other as their mothers stood with heads lifted, even when the riders struck them to make them bow, and the river kept flowing behind them, and the breeze moved through the valley like it was carrying the last breath of peace away. The leader of the riders rode his horse slowly past the women, looking into their eyes one by one, and some of the women spat at him, and some cursed him in the old language, and some closed their eyes to remember the faces of their children so they could hold on to that memory as the last light in a world turning black. And the leader did not speak, he only watched, and then he raised his hand, and the riders pulled the women forward into the river. The water was cold and clear, washing over their feet as they stood shoulder to shoulder, and the leader of the riders dismounted and stepped into the river, the water parting around his boots as he walked slowly in front of the women, his reflection breaking into pieces around him, and he pulled the blade from his belt, and the steel caught the light of the sun like a promise, and the children who watched from the banks held their breath. the air thick with smoke and fear, and the river moved slowly, as if it knew it was about to carry away something it could never return, and the leader stopped in front of a woman with long dark hair and eyes that burned like coals, and she did not look away, and the leader lifted the blade, and she did not scream, and the children did not cry, they only watched as the blade fell, and the river turned red, and the riders moved forward with their blades, and the sky was filled with the cries of the children, and the roar of the riders, and the whisper of the river, as it carried the blood of the women away, and the leader of the riders closed his eyes for a moment, and in that darkness he saw the world breaking, the world that had known peace for 4,000 years, shattering under the weight of 500 women falling into the river, and the children, who watched, would never forget the sound of the water as it carried their mothers away, and the world would never know peace again. The children who watched from the broken doorways and behind the blackened fences could not understand why the river was red, why the air smelled like iron and smoke, and why the women who had once held them when they were afraid were now falling into the water like stones, sinking without a sound, and the leader of the riders stood in the river with the blood swirling around, his boots looking up at the sky that was turning gray, as if even the sun did not want to see what was happening below, and the riders pulled the next woman forward, and she was singing softly under her breath a song that her mother had taught her, a song about the rain coming to wash the earth and feed the crops, and the children could hear that song even over the shouting of the riders and the crackling of the fires, and for a moment the world felt still, as if the river itself was listening to her voice before it carried her away. And the next woman had a child in her arms, and the riders tore the child from her hands, and the child screamed, a scream that seemed to split the air, and the mother did not cry, she only looked at the child with eyes that held the whole of the world inside them, before the riders pushed her down into the water, and the river took her, and the child reached out, and the riders pulled the child back, and the leader of the riders turned away so he would not see the child reaching for the mother, who was gone, and the riders kept moving forward, their blades flashing and their faces dark and empty, and the river grew darker with every breath, with every heartbeat, and the children who watched felt something cold grow inside them, something that would never leave them, something that would whisper to them at night when they closed their eyes and saw the river and the women and the riders again and again and again, and the old men who had survived stood in the shadows with their hands over their mouths, unable to speak, unable to move, unable to look away, as the riders took what could never be returned, and the leader of the riders lifted his hand, and the riders stopped for a moment, and the river was full of the bodies of the women who had kept the stories of the valley alive, who had sung the children to sleep, who had taught the young men how to plant and how to heal and how to listen to the wind. And the leader looked at what he had done, and he did not feel triumph, and he did not feel victory. He felt nothing but the cold of the river soaking through his boots as he turned and climbed back onto his horse, the blood dripping from his blade onto the earth, and he looked down at the children, who were watching him with wide eyes that were no longer the eyes of children, and he knew that they would remember him. He knew that they would carry this moment in their blood and in their bones, and that one day they would come for him and for his riders, and the peace that had lived in the valley for 4,000 years would never come back, because the river had taken the women, and the children had taken the memory, and the world would never be clean again. When the screams came, they did not sound like fear, they sounded like thunder cracking the air open. They sounded like the earth itself was splitting under the weight of what was happening in the river, where the water was no longer clear, and the riders did not stop. They moved like shadows with blades catching the gray light, and the blood fell into the water with every breath, with every heartbeat, and the children, who were watching from the tree line, felt the screams move through their bones like lightning, and they could not cover their ears because they could not look away. They saw their mothers and sisters and aunts fall into the river, and the river carried them away, and the children felt something break inside them, something that would never heal, and the men who tried to fight back with sticks and stones were cut down in the mud, their blood joining the blood of the women in the water, and the smoke rose from the burning homes, and the wind carried the smell of fire and iron through the valley, and the old people who had seen the world before peace came to the valley fell to their knees in the dirt, crying out to the sky that had turned black with smoke and ash, and the leader of the riders sat on his black horse watching as the screams rose around him, watching as the blood spread across the ground like a dark river, reaching for the edges of the fields that had once fed the village. And in his hand he held the blade that had taken the lives of the women, and he felt the weight of it in his hand, heavy, as if it was filled with the voices of the dead and the children. who were hiding, saw him, and they saw his face, and they saw the emptiness in his eyes, and they knew that this man would never leave their minds. He would follow them in every dream and every breath and every heartbeat. And the river kept moving, carrying the women away as the riders turned their horses toward the fields, riding slowly past the homes that were burning. And the leader raised his hand, and the riders stopped, and the silence that followed was louder than the screams had been. The children were holding each other, their eyes wide and dark as the ashes fell around them like black snow. And the leader looked at the children, and then he looked at the river, and he saw the red water moving under the gray sky. And for a moment, he felt something move in his chest, something like fear, something like regret. But he turned his horse away from the river, and the riders followed him, leaving the village in silence, leaving the children standing in the ashes, leaving the river to carry away the women who had held the peace of the world in their hands for 4,000 years. And the wind moved through the valley, and the smoke rose into the sky, and the children who were left behind knew that nothing would ever be the same, and they knew that the screams they had heard would live in their hearts forever, and they knew that war had come, and it would never leave, and that the world would never be clean again. A girl with a red ribbon in her hair stood at the edge of the river, her feet sinking into the mud as she watched the water take the bodies of the women away, her small hands clutching the torn edge of her dress that was too big for her now. But her mother was gone, and the ribbon in her hair was the only bright thing left in the gray world around her, and she could still hear the screams. Even though the riders were gone and the smoke was drifting away, she could still hear the voices of the women singing under their breath as they were led into the river. She could still see the way the leader of the riders looked at them. With eyes that were empty as winter sky, she could feel the way the earth shook when the men tried to fight, and fell in the mud with blood pouring from their mouths. And she knew, even though she was small, even though her hands were small, and her voice was small, she knew that something had ended, something had broken that would never be fixed again. And the ribbon slipped from her hair and fell into the water, and she watched it float away, spinning slowly in the red current like a tiny flag, waving goodbye to a world that was gone. And she stepped into the water, reaching for the ribbon, but it moved away from her, carried by the river that had taken her mother and the others. And she stood in the water that was cold and sticky against her legs, and she felt the river pulling at her as if it wanted to take her too, as if it was hungry for every last piece of the world that had once been filled with laughter and song and warm bread in the morning. And she turned and saw the other children watching her, their eyes wide and dark and hollow like the sky after the fire had burned away the light, and they were holding each other, not speaking because they could not find words that would fit in a world like this. And she stepped back out of the water, and the mud clung to her feet and her legs, and the other children stepped forward to her, and they all looked at the river that was moving away, carrying the ribbon, and the bodies, and the songs, and the prayers, and the stories of the old world. And the girl with the empty hair reached down and picked up a shard of glass from the ground. It was from a jar that had once held honey, and it caught the light of the sun that was trying to come through the smoke. And she looked into the glass and saw her own eyes, and in them she saw the reflection of the river, and the blood, and the sky, and the fire. And she saw the face of her mother looking back at her for just a moment before it was gone. And she held the shard of glass in her hand until it cut her skin, and the blood dripped onto the mud, and she did not cry. And the other children did not cry. They stood there in the mud and the ashes with the smell of smoke in their hair. And they knew that the world was broken, and they knew that war had come, and it would never leave, and they knew that the red ribbon would never come back. The children who watched from the trees with ashes in their hair and mud on their feet did not run when the riders left. They did not go back to the homes that were nothing but burned wood and smoke. They stayed near the river that had taken their mothers and sisters and grandmothers. They watched the water moving slowly under the gray sky, carrying the red away from them. And they felt the cold air on their skin, and it felt like the touch of the dead. And one by one the children reached down and took the mud from the edge of the river, and they smeared it across their faces, across their arms, across their chests, until they were covered in the dark earth that smelled like blood and smoke. And they looked at each other through the mud and the ash, and they did not see fear. They saw the reflection of the river in each other's eyes. They saw the memory of the women who had stood in the water with their heads high. Even when the blades fell, they saw the memory of the men who had tried to fight with shaking hands and broken tools, and they saw the memory of the leader of the riders sitting on his horse, with eyes as empty as the winter fields. And they felt something grow inside them, something sharp and cold, something that would never leave them. They swore to the leaves, they swore to the broken trees, they swore to the sky that had turned black that they would remember. Every face of every rider. They would remember the sound of the blades in the air. They would remember the screams that had not been screams of fear but screams of thunder and promise. And they would remember the way the river had taken the bodies of the women without stopping, without slowing, without caring. And they would never let the world forget what had happened in the valley. And the smallest child, a boy with hair like night and eyes like winter, picked up a stone from the riverbank, and he held it in his hand, and he whispered to it the names of the women he could remember. He whispered the name of his mother and the names of the women who had given him bread, and who had sung while they worked, and who had told him stories of how the world was before. And he held that stone as if it was the last piece of the world that was worth keeping. And the other children picked up stones too, and they held them to their chests, and they whispered into them with voices that were hoarse from smoke and crying. And the river moved past them, carrying the red away, and the children stood together, covered in mud and ashes, holding stones against their hearts, and they felt the world change around them. They felt the sky watching them. They felt the earth breathing under their feet, and they knew that the peace that had lived in the valley for 4,000 years was gone, and they knew that war had come and it would never leave, and they knew that they would carry the memory of that day in their bones and in their blood and in their breath, and that one day they would find the riders, and they would find the leader with the empty eyes, and they would bring the river back to him, and they would show him what the children of the valley had become. Years passed, but the river never forgot, and neither did the children who had stood on its banks. With mud on their faces and stones in their hands, they grew under a sky that never cleared fully from the smoke of that day. They learned to walk with silence. They learned to hunt in the darkness. They learned to listen to the wind for the sound of hooves and iron. And they never sang, they never laughed, they never forgot the screams that had sounded like thunder when the blades fell into the water. They learned the names of the riders. They learned the name of the leader with eyes empty as winter, and they whispered those names to the stones. They kept hidden under their beds. They whispered those names to the trees when they walked alone. In the burned fields, they whispered those names to the river. When they washed the ashes from their hair, they grew taller. Their arms became strong. Their eyes became cold like the river in winter. And in their dreams, they saw the day the sky turned black. They saw the red in the water, and the women standing in the river with heads high. They saw the leader on his black horse turning away with blood on his blade, and they felt the promise they had made under the ash and the smoke. They would remember, and they would return. The day came when the wind brought the smell of horses and iron again. The riders were coming back, their banners black, their blades sharp and ready for more blood. They thought the valley would be empty. They thought the children would have died or forgotten, but the children had grown, and they had not forgotten. They stood in the fields where their mothers had planted grain, and they held the stones they had whispered to for years in one hand, and in the other hand they held blades made from the iron of the burned homes, sharpened over years of waiting. The leader of the riders rode at the front, his eyes scanning the valley, his hand resting on the blade that had taken the women, and he saw the children standing in the fields, the wind moving through their hair, the ashes of the past swirling around their feet, and he felt something move in his chest. Something like the memory of fear, something like the ghost of regret. But he lifted his hand, and the riders moved forward. The children did not move. They stood silent as the riders approached. They let the riders see their faces, let them see the eyes that held the river, and the screams and the blood. Let them see the mud that still covered their arms like armor. Let them see the stones that had been whispered to with the names of the dead. And when the riders came close, the children raised their blades, and the stones and the wind moved, and the river whispered, and the sky watched, and the children charged, and the valley that had been silent for years heard the sound of war again, and the riders who had killed the women felt the thunder come for them as the children of the river became the storm that would never end. The children moved like shadows under the gray sky, their feet silent on the black earth, their breath steady like the river that had taught them how to wait. And when they reached the riders, they did not scream, they did not shout. They let the memory of the women in the river guide their hands. They let the memory of the screams that were like thunder fill their hearts with the storm, and they struck the riders from their horses, pulling them down into the mud where the blood of the past still waited. And the leader of the riders saw the children coming with blades made of broken iron, and hands that did not shake, and eyes that did not blink. And for the first time, he saw the faces of the women in their eyes. He saw the faces of the children. From that day when the river turned red, and he felt the cold of the river again, soaking through his boots, and he knew that the river had come back for him. The riders tried to fight, but the children did not fear the iron. They did not fear the hooves or the screams of the blood. They moved together like the wind over the fields. They moved together like the ashes in the smoke. They moved together like the river itself, pulling everything into its cold embrace, and the riders fell under the weight of the promise the children had made to the stones and to the sky, and to the memory of the women and the river. The mud was wet with the blood of the riders, and the children did not stop. They moved from one to the next with the silence of the grave, with the certainty of the storm. They did not cry, they did not laugh, they did not speak, and the sky watched as the riders fell, and the leader of the riders found himself alone in the center of the field, surrounded by the bodies of his men, and the children standing in the ashes, and the blood and the wind moved around him cold and sharp, and the memory of the river would not leave him. It moved in his mind like the current under the gray sky, and he lifted his blade, the same blade that had taken the women, and it felt heavy in his hand, heavy with the weight of the screams and the blood and the ghosts of the past. And he looked at the children, and he saw the river in their eyes, and he saw the storm that would never end, and he knew that the world he had broken would never heal, and he knew that the children would never stop coming for him, until the river had taken him too. And he felt the fear in his chest like ice, and he tried to swing the blade, but the children moved as one, and they pulled him from the horse, and he fell into the mud and the blood and the ashes, and the children stood over him, their eyes like the winter sky, and they did not speak. They lifted their blades, and the river moved in their hearts, and the promise they had made came alive in that moment, as the leader of the riders saw the faces of the women, one last time before the storm claimed him, and the children did not look away, and the river moved on, and the sky remained gray, and the war that had returned to the valley would never leave again. The river was quiet after the storm had passed, but it was not clean. It would never be clean again. The children stood in the field around the body of the leader of the riders, the blood soaking into the earth that had once fed them, and they did not feel victory, they did not feel triumph. They felt the silence pressing against their chests. They felt the weight of the promise they had kept, and they looked at the sky that had watched them from the moment the women had fallen into the river, and they saw that it was still gray, the ashes still falling like black snow, the wind still carrying the smell of iron and smoke. They turned to the river, and they walked with their bare feet through the mud, through the blood, through the memory of every scream that had become the thunder inside them. They walked into the water, where the women had stood with their heads high, and their voices soft, and they let the river touch their skin, and take the blood from their hands and their arms, and their faces, and the river took the blood, but it did not take the memory, it did not take the promise, it did not take the storm that lived in their hearts. The children, who were no longer children, looked at each other with eyes that held the river and the ashes and the faces of the women, who had sung while the world was still alive. They looked at each other, and they knew that the valley would never be the same. They knew that the peace that had lived for 4,000 years would never return, and they knew that the world had changed, and it would not change back. They left the field where the riders lay in the mud, and they left the river that had carried the women away, and they walked through the valley with the wind moving around them, whispering to the burned trees and the blackened earth. They walked past the homes that were nothing but ashes, and they walked past the fields where nothing would grow again, and they walked until they reached the high places where the wind was sharp and cold, and the sky felt close enough to touch, and they stood there with the river below them and the gray sky above them, and the ashes swirling around their feet, and they raised their hands to the sky, and they raised their voices for the first time in years, and they did not scream, and they did not cry. They sang the song of the women who had stood in the river. They sang the song of the mothers who had taught them how to plant and how to heal and how to listen to the wind, and they sang the song of the old world that had died in the river and in the ashes, and they sang for the promise they had kept, and they sang for the world that would never heal, and they sang for the storm that would live forever, in their blood and in their bones and in their breath. And the river moved below them, carrying the memory away, but the memory would not leave, and the children, who were no longer children, sang to the sky that had watched them, and to the earth that had held them, and to the wind that had carried the ashes, and to the river that would never be clean again, and they sang until the gray sky turned black and the world became quiet again.